For 9 years, Marcus Reid took a division that was hemorrhaging money and turned it into the strongest profit engine at Ashford Meridian. He talked the hardest clients out of walking away, saved contracts everyone else had already given up on, and carried an entire department on his back without ever asking for credit. Then, in a meeting attended by the whole company, CEO Vivian Ashford pointed to her nephew, a young man fresh out of business school, and told Marcus flatly that from now on he would report to him. Marcus didn't argue. He set his badge on the table and walked out. 6 months later, Vivian showed up at his office begging for help. Marcus arrived at the Ashford Meridian Tower in Denver before almost anyone else, carrying his own coffee instead of sending an assistant for it, wearing a suit that had seen more winters than most of the junior staff had years on the job. He didn't need an entourage to be recognized, because the recognition had already been earned. 9 years of showing up when things fell apart and staying invisible when they went right. That morning, like most mornings, 3 major contracts inside his division needed his attention at once, and one of them was already unraveling. A transportation software rollout for a client worth $80 million had stalled, and the client was hours from invoking a termination clause. Marcus didn't summon a committee or draft a memo blaming the technical staff. He pulled the engineering lead, the legal counsel, and the operations manager into one room and refused to let anyone leave until they understood the actual problem instead of the symptom everyone had been chasing. Within one meeting, he realized the failure had nothing to do with the new platform his team had built. The client's own legacy systems were feeding in corrupted records, a detail buried 3 layers beneath the surface complaint. He got on the phone himself, walked the client's operations director through the discrepancy line by line, and talked them into holding off on cancellation for 48 hours while his team built a workaround. It was the kind of save that never made headlines, the kind that just kept the lights on for hundreds of employees who never knew how close the account had come to collapsing. Watching how people gravitated toward Marcus throughout the building, it was clear he wasn't just a division head on an org chart. He was the one who settled disputes before they escalated, who remembered which engineer thrived under pressure and which one needed a quieter assignment, who knew instinctively which clients wanted hard numbers and which ones needed reassurance delivered like a conversation instead of a report. He kept a small notebook on his desk, not for show, but for memory, filled with details most executives never bothered to track. Which client's operations director had a daughter starting college? Which engineer had just come back from parental leave and needed a lighter rotation? Which vendor had quietly saved the division from a shipping disaster 2 winters back? He believed competence without context was hollow, and he built his reputation not on grand pronouncements but on 1,000 small acts of attention that added up to something like trust. When a junior analyst made a costly error in a client forecast, Marcus didn't escalate it to HR or hold it over the young man's head in a review. He sat with him after hours, walked through the mistake line by line, and sent him home with a clearer understanding of the model instead of a wound to his confidence. Stories like that traveled quietly through the division, the way real reputations do, without press releases or company-wide emails. Summit Division had once been considered the weakest unit inside Ashford Meridian, a place executives were quietly relieved not to be assigned to. 9 years under Marcus's leadership turned it into the operation with the highest client retention in the company and a source of nearly 40% of total operating profit. Vivian took credit for that transformation in press interviews and investor calls more often than she mentioned Marcus's name at all, and for a long time he let it go, telling himself a stable team mattered more than a headline. During a short break that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from his daughter, Maya, a 19-year-old sophomore 2 states away. She asked, a little nervously, whether he could make time for a virtual presentation that weekend, and Marcus promised he'd be there no matter how the week unfolded. He'd raised her largely on his own since losing his wife years earlier. The story of his household never needed to dominate the story of his career, but it explained why he understood, better than almost anyone in that building, what it meant to carry something heavy without complaint. Later that week, a calendar invitation appeared in Marcus's inbox for something called a special restructuring session. It hadn't come from Vivian. It had come from Dorian Ashford, a man who had never spent a single day working inside Summit and who was, as far as Marcus knew, still finishing his last semester of business school. Only months earlier, Dorian had arrived at Summit carrying himself like a man who already owned the place. He brought 2 outside consultants with him, and within his first hour he was demanding staff prepare reports on what he called the outdated processes holding the division back from real growth. In his first sit-down with Marcus, Dorian asked nothing about clients, nothing about staffing risk, nothing about the fragile agreements Marcus had spent years nursing along. He wanted to know whether revenue could climb 25% inside 2 quarters, as though the number itself were the whole strategy. Marcus explained, patiently and without condescension, that Summit handled complex, high-margin projects carrying real operational risk, and that pushing growth too fast would overwhelm the implementation teams and break promises made to clients who trusted the division precisely because it didn't overpromise. Dorian smiled thinly and told Marcus he had the thinking of a middle manager, then rattled off a handful of frameworks from his coursework, insisting Summit's success had been a matter of favorable market timing rather than anyone's judgment. Marcus didn't take the bait. He walked Dorian through the division's risk dashboard, the list of accounts requiring close monitoring, and a 6-month staffing plan built to absorb shocks before they became emergencies. Dorian skimmed it for a few seconds and dismissed the whole thing as, in his words, spreadsheets built out of fear. Dorian's consultants filled the walls of the borrowed conference room with printed. Marcus studied the slides without visible irritation and asked a single question: which accounts the projected growth would come from. Dorian waved it away, saying the details could be worked out later. Vision mattered more than arithmetic at this stage. Marcus had heard variations of that sentence before, usually from people who'd never had to explain a missed deadline to a client already skeptical of promises. He said nothing further in the meeting, choosing instead to document his concerns in writing afterward, the way he always did, so that if the plan failed later there'd be a clear record that the warning had been given honestly and in good faith. Elena Cruz, Summit's operations director and Marcus's closest lieutenant, tried to defend the dashboard's reasoning and was cut off mid-sentence. Dorian announced that from then on, every report handed to him would be reduced to 3 figures. Revenue, contract velocity, staff utilization, nothing else. Within days he'd claimed Marcus's private conference room for himself before any formal appointment had even been announced, and instructed Marcus's assistant to reroute client scheduling to his own calendar, even as he skipped half his meetings for long lunches with prospective investors. Vivian knew about all of it and chose not to intervene, wanting Marcus to feel his footprint shrinking on its own, believing pressure alone would make him accept a diminished role without a fight. It was Elena, not Marcus, who first found the internal memo scheduling Dorian's formal announcement to the entire company. The title on the document read Executive Vice President of Summit, 1 level above Marcus's own. No one had discussed the decision with him at all. The annual strategy meeting was held in the largest hall in the building, filled with senior leadership, board members, and hundreds of employees watching from their desks through a live feed. Marcus had assumed, perhaps naively, that Vivian would at least speak with him privately before an announcement of that size. Instead, she turned his demotion into a public spectacle, a demonstration of authority delivered in front of an audience large enough to make resistance humiliating. Vivian opened by calling Summit the crown jewel of Ashford Meridian, then invited Dorian onto the stage beside her. She announced he'd take responsibility for reshaping Summit for what she called a new era of growth. Marcus would keep his title as division head, she said, but every significant decision would now require Dorian's approval first. In front of hundreds of colleagues, she turned to Marcus directly and told him he'd done fine work, but that building a division and leading it into the future were 2 entirely different skills. Marcus asked, in a level voice that carried through the silent hall, whether she was asking him to stay accountable for results while handing the actual decisions to someone else. Vivian answered coldly that from that day forward he'd report to her nephew, and that a genuinely loyal employee wouldn't treat the arrangement as an insult. Dorian added that Marcus still had plenty to learn if he could just adjust his thinking, a remark that drew a wince from several executives nearby, though Vivian mistook their discomfort for quiet agreement. Marcus walked onto the stage, unclipped his badge, and set it down in front of Vivian without raising his voice or threatening anything. He told her she had every right to choose who ran her division, just as he had every right to choose whose authority he'd work under. Then he resigned, effective immediately, and offered to complete a full handoff of documentation as required by his contract. Vivian laughed it off, certain he was staging a negotiation for a raise, and had building security walk him out to prove that no one, however valuable, could challenge her authority and remain standing afterward. As Marcus passed the Summit team on his way out, no one clapped and no one objected. The room was too stunned to react at all. Vivian watched that silence and told Dorian with satisfaction that by Monday morning, everyone would have forgotten Marcus had ever worked there. The hall stayed quiet for a long moment after the doors closed behind him, the kind of silence that settles when everyone realizes at once that something irreversible has just happened. A few executives exchanged glances but said nothing, unwilling to be the first to question a decision Vivian had made so publicly and with such confidence. Outside in the parking garage, Marcus sat behind the wheel of his car for several minutes before starting the engine. Not out of regret, but out of the strange, unfamiliar quiet of no longer being needed by anyone in that building. He drove home without the radio on, replaying the morning, not with anger but with something closer to relief, the particular relief of finally setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. On Monday morning, Dorian opened the division's operating systems and found every document exactly where it should be, every process fully outlined, every handoff completed to the letter. What none of it could tell him was who to call the moment a major client abruptly threatened to pull out of an active rollout, because that kind of knowledge had never lived inside a folder. It lived inside a man who was no longer answering his phone for Ashford Meridian at all. Marcus had taken nothing with him when he left, hadn't copied a single file, deleted a single record, or reached out to a single employee to follow him out the door. He'd left behind everything the role required on paper. What Dorian discovered within days was that a manual could describe an ordinary process, but it could never replace 9 years of judgment built from handling the situations no manual anticipated. When Vantage Freight, the division's largest client, requested a call with Marcus about a data discrepancy threatening their rollout, Dorian announced Marcus was no longer necessary and ran the meeting himself. Rather than acknowledge the severity of the problem, he delivered a polished presentation promising completion 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Grant Kessler, the blunt, unsentimental CEO of Vantage Freight, listened carefully and understood immediately that the young man across the table didn't yet grasp how serious the underlying risk actually was. To prove Marcus had simply been overly cautious, Dorian began dismantling the very safeguards that had kept Summit stable for years. He cancelled the weekly risk review meetings that had once caught small problems before they became public failures. He pushed already stretched engineers onto new projects without adjusting timelines. He reassigned 2 of the division's most experienced specialists to the sales team, chasing new signatures instead of protecting existing delivery. He rewarded staff for the number of contracts signed rather than the quality of what got delivered afterward. He told employees never to bring up Marcus's name in meetings, as if the mention alone were disloyalty. He also stripped Elena of her authority to pause a project when the data didn't add up, a power she'd used sparingly but decisively for years. Employees who'd once felt free to flag a problem the moment they spotted it started keeping concerns to themselves, watching colleagues get reassigned or quietly reprimanded for raising exactly the kind of warning Marcus had always welcomed. A culture that had taken 9 years to build began eroding within weeks. Not through any single dramatic decision, but through an accumulation of small signals that honesty was no longer rewarded the way it once had been. Meetings that used to run 20 minutes because everyone trusted the numbers on the screen stretched into hours of hedging and careful phrasing as staff tried to describe real problems without sounding like they were undermining the new leadership. Elena noticed the shift first in her own team's body language. The way people glanced at the door before speaking freely, the way enthusiasm curdled into caution. She kept doing her job as well as she could, but began saving copies of every email exchange, sensing the ground beneath all of them was no longer as stable as it looked on paper. When she warned Dorian that one of the newly signed contracts relied on data that had never been properly validated, he accused her of clinging to what he called Marcus's bureaucratic legacy. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to a quiet apartment where his phone, for the first time in years, didn't ring constantly with work emergencies. He sat through Maya's entire virtual presentation without interruption, something he'd rarely managed before, and afterward she asked gently whether he regretted what he'd done. He admitted he was worried about what came next, but told her a job could pay someone's bills, though it was never entitled to take a person's self-respect in exchange. He didn't rush into another position. Instead, he spent several weeks revisiting old offers he'd once turned down out of loyalty to a company that, it turned out, had never truly returned that loyalty. A former client introduced him to a group of investors searching for someone who could rescue struggling technology firms from the inside, and Marcus accepted a small consulting project entirely unconnected to Ashford Meridian. While Marcus quietly helped a new client recover a contract everyone else assumed was already lost, Summit took its first serious blow. Vantage Freight froze an $18 million payment after the division missed a critical implementation milestone, a failure that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Rather than acknowledge that Dorian's decisions had caused the collapse, Vivian insisted publicly that Marcus had built a system so dependent on one person that he'd deliberately engineered the company's failure. She ordered the legal department to investigate him for wrongdoing. The investigation turned up nothing. No stolen data, no deleted files, no employees he'd contacted, no clients who'd signed with him, and every access credential he'd once held had been surrendered exactly according to policy. Vivian's fury only deepened because she couldn't manufacture a betrayal that had simply never occurred. Talented people began leaving on their own, without coordination or encouragement from Marcus. A technical director resigned after Dorian publicly blamed him for failures caused directly by Dorian's own compressed timelines. 2 account managers left for competitors soon after. Marcus refused to hire any of them himself, unwilling to give Vivian even the appearance of poaching. Elena stayed behind out of responsibility to the people still on her team, carefully documenting every warning she sent Dorian through official channels so there could be no confusion later about who had raised the alarm, and when. In one meeting, Dorian declared that Marcus had convinced everyone the division couldn't survive without him, and vowed to prove he'd never been special at all. Moments later, a screen at the front of the room lit up with notice that a second client was now formally requesting an exit from their contract. Marcus's first consulting engagement succeeded well beyond expectations, saving the client company from millions in potential penalties, and word of his work spread quickly to 2 additional businesses in similar trouble. He founded Reid Summit Advisory, a lean restructuring consultancy, hiring a small team of specialists drawn from a range of industries, deliberately avoiding anyone tied to Ashford Meridian. His reputation grew because he didn't just hand clients a diagnosis and walk away, he stayed embedded with their teams until the underlying systems were actually fixed. Grant Kessler eventually reached out directly, careful not to ask Marcus to disclose anything confidential about his former employer, simply asking whether Reid Summit might provide an independent assessment of the Vantage rollout once the existing contract term expired. Marcus agreed, on the condition that every legal boundary be respected without exception. Vivian came across a trade publication praising Reid Summit for rescuing a struggling logistics firm in under a month. She tossed the article aside and dismissed it as luck, unwilling to entertain any other explanation. Julian Vance, the chairman of the board, quietly kept his own copy. That same quarter, financial reports showed that for the first time in 9 years, Summit hadn't merely missed its targets, it had recorded an outright operating loss. Vivian ordered the finance team to delay presenting the figures to the board. Determined to deliver a signature win of his own, Dorian pursued a contract with Corestone National, a major retail chain, seeking a complete overhaul of its distribution systems. It would be the largest deal in Summit's history, but the proposed timeline bordered on impossible. Elena and the technical team calculated the division could only realistically take on the work if it delayed 2 existing contracts or brought in additional specialized staff. Dorian rejected both options because either would have shrunk the profit margin on his own report. He told Elena that Marcus had trained everyone to look for reasons to say no, while he intended to teach them how to win instead. Vivian approved the contract anyway, eager to announce it publicly before an upcoming investor meeting. What followed was a chain of compounding mistakes. Dorian pulled staff off the still-troubled Vantage account to redirect them to Corestone. He instructed the technical team to skip a full testing phase in favor of a flashy demonstration built on sample data instead of live systems. When one manager discovered that the progress figures in an internal report didn't reflect the project's real state, Dorian removed him from the assignment entirely rather than address the discrepancy. Elena escalated a formal warning directly to Vivian, who forwarded it to Dorian without reading it in full. Dorian then pressured Elena to sign off on the project's readiness. She refused, and instead filed a memo with the compliance department documenting exactly why. In the days leading up to the demonstration, the engineering team worked through consecutive late nights, trying to compress months of proper testing into a fraction of the time it required, running on takeout food and nervous energy rather than confidence in the product they were about to show a client. One senior engineer quietly told a colleague the platform wasn't ready, that they were essentially gambling with a client relationship that had taken years to build. But neither of them felt safe repeating that out loud in front of Dorian, not after watching what had happened to the manager removed from the project weeks earlier. The night before the presentation, someone ran a final check and noticed an inconsistency in how warehouse inventory numbers were syncing across regions. A flaw that under normal circumstances would have triggered an automatic delay. The warning reached Dorian's inbox close to midnight. He read it, decided the presentation would proceed as scheduled regardless, and told the team to prepare a manual workaround just in case, a patch rather than a fix, applied under pressure and without proper review. During the live demonstration in front of Corestone's executive team, the system failed to synchronize its warehouse data in real time. Dorian tried blaming the client's own network connection, but Corestone's engineers quickly traced the failure back to a configuration error inside Summit's systems. Corestone suspended the contract and triggered a clause demanding the return of its advance payment. News of the failure spread quickly through the industry. Vantage Freight, already uneasy, grew convinced that Ashford Meridian no longer had the staff needed to finish its own project and issued formal notice of termination. 2 other clients requested independent audits soon after. In the emergency meeting that followed, Vivian didn't confront Dorian at all. Instead, she turned on Elena and the division's remaining longtime staff, demanding to know how much longer they intended to use a man who'd left 6 months earlier as an excuse. Elena set a full file in front of her containing every warning Dorian had ignored along the way. Vivian refused to open it and demanded Elena resign on the spot. Elena answered calmly that no one needed to fire her, she'd already submitted her resignation that same morning. Her departure triggered a wave of exits with no coordination or conspiracy behind it. Each person simply recognized they were being asked to absorb consequences for decisions that had never been theirs to make. Summit lost nearly a third of its senior staff within 3 weeks. In the weeks that followed, the mood inside Summit's offices changed in ways that had nothing to do with revenue figures. Desks emptied out gradually rather than all at once, leaving gaps nobody rushed to fill. Hallway conversations that used to hum with people solving problems together grew sparse and guarded. Dorian spent less time on the floor and more time behind a closed door with outside consultants drafting explanations for the board rather than solutions for clients still waiting on delayed deliverables. Vivian began avoiding investor calls she'd once handled with practiced confidence, delegating them instead to subordinates who had no real answers to offer either. The building itself seemed to lose some of its color. The easy hum of a place that used to run like a well-tuned machine replaced by the low static of an organization quietly bracing for something it didn't yet have a name for. Julian called an emergency board session. When the CFO was asked how much operating cash the division had left if Vantage's damages claim succeeded, the answer was blunt: less than 8 weeks. Reid's Summit Advisory didn't occupy anything resembling a lavish headquarters. It filled 2 modest floors of an older building, but the atmosphere inside was focused and respectful in a way Summit had once been and had since lost entirely. Marcus had built the firm around a handful of simple principles. The person accountable for an outcome had to hold the authority to make the decisions behind it. Warnings about risk were never treated as disloyalty. Achievements were credited publicly rather than absorbed by whoever sat above them. And no contract was signed unless the team taking it on could actually deliver. The company was steady rather than sprawling, but it was profitable, and its reputation was spreading fast through word of mouth alone. Marcus had spent the month since his resignation rebuilding something from almost nothing. Hiring carefully, turning down clients whose timeline seemed built for headlines rather than results, insisting Reid Summit would grow only as fast as its people could sustain without burning out. He kept a framed photo of Maya on his desk instead of any industry award, and made a habit of eating lunch with whichever team happened to be struggling that week rather than retreating to his own office. The firm's early wins hadn't come from aggressive marketing or flashy pitches, but from a slow accumulation of trust, one rescued contract at a time, one honest conversation at a time. By the time Vivian's car pulled up outside, Reid Summit occupied both floors comfortably, its walls still mostly bare, its culture still young, but already unmistakably different from the one Marcus had left behind. Vivian arrived without any warning at all. 6 months earlier she'd ordered security to escort Marcus out of a building he'd spent 9 years building up from nothing. Now she sat in a modest reception area and waited for him to finish another meeting before she could get 5 minutes of his time. She opened by pretending to be generous, telling him she was willing to overlook the manner of his departure. Marcus said nothing to the gesture and simply asked what she actually needed. Vivian offered him his old role running Summit, doubled his previous salary, promised a bonus tied to saving both the Vantage and Corestone accounts, and told him Dorian would keep a senior title while staying entirely out of day-to-day operations. The offer revealed just how little Vivian still understood about what had actually gone wrong. She wanted Marcus to shoulder the responsibility again while her family retained the authority and the credit that came with it. Marcus told her plainly that Summit couldn't be saved by placing him back inside the same broken structure that had failed it in the first place. Vivian's composure cracked, and she reminded him she'd given him his chance years earlier, when he was still an unknown manager with no real name in the industry. Marcus answered that she'd given him a title, and in exchange he'd handed her a division worth billions of dollars, so neither of them owed the other anything further. What she'd done instead was destroy whatever respect had once existed between them. When she threatened to make sure no client would ever feel safe working with Reid Summit again, Marcus slid a folder across the table toward her. It wasn't a lawsuit, and it wasn't evidence assembled for retaliation. It was a set of formal letters of intent from Vantage Freight, Corestone National, and 2 additional clients, each stating a willingness to sign or resume work only if Summit were separated from Ashford Meridian entirely and placed under an independent leadership team headed by Marcus. He wasn't there to negotiate his way back onto someone else's payroll. He was preparing to acquire the very division Vivian had allowed to collapse. Vivian laughed it off, insisting he could never afford to buy it. Marcus told her he didn't need his own money, only enough people who still believed the division was worth saving. The door opened behind her and Julian Vance walked in, accompanied by representatives from 2 investment funds. Julian informed Vivian that the board had launched an independent inquiry after discovering she'd delayed presenting the company's true financial losses. The findings were damning in their simplicity. Vivian had known Dorian lacked the experience for the role and handed him full authority regardless. Numerous internal warnings had been ignored at every level. Progress reports for the Corestone project had been misrepresented before they ever reached investors. Vivian had concealed the true scale of Summit's losses for months. Her continued insistence on keeping Dorian in place had directly cost the division clients who refused to negotiate as long as he remained involved. The board, Julian explained, faced 2 paths: pour more capital into Summit and risk a wave of litigation, or sell the division to an investment group led by Marcus, preserving jobs and limiting further damage to shareholders. Vivian tried one last accusation, claiming Marcus had simply waited for the division to weaken so he could buy it cheaply. Marcus produced his entire record of communications, proving he'd never approached a single Ashford Meridian client until they came to him first, and that every term of his involvement fell strictly within his contractual boundaries. He'd even offered a price above the value of a straightforward asset liquidation because he wanted to keep both the staff and the Summit name intact. The accusation collapsed under its own weight. Dorian was summoned into the room next. He blamed the staff for failing to adapt and accused Marcus of having planted a culture of resistance before he ever left the company. Elena entered as a witness for the board's inquiry, laying out emails, internal memos, and risk reports that Dorian had dismissed one after another. He couldn't deny any of it, since every document carried his own electronic signature. Julian asked him a simple question. Over the past 6 months, how many major client meetings had he walked into without someone else preparing his answers in advance? Dorian had no answer to give. Marcus didn't demand a public apology from Vivian. His conditions were practical. Summit would be separated entirely from Ashford Meridian. Employees who'd lost bonuses because of leadership's failures would be compensated fairly. Staff who'd already resigned would be free to reapply without retaliation. Dorian would hold no position of any kind inside the new Summit. Reid Summit would take over operational leadership, and a meaningful share of ownership would be reserved for longtime employees who'd kept the division running through its worst months. Julian announced that the board had already voted informally in favor of the deal. Sitting there, Vivian realized that her visit to Marcus's office had never been a job interview at all. She'd arrived as someone begging for rescue while Marcus had already become the partner the board needed to persuade, not the other way around. Vivian played her final card, declaring she'd use the family's voting shares to block the sale outright. Julian set another resolution in front of her instead, one calling for her immediate suspension as chief executive over the concealment of material information from the board. Vivian called the board members who'd once stood firmly behind her, only to find that mounting losses and the looming threat of litigation had eroded whatever loyalty remained. The Ashford family still held a substantial ownership stake, but not enough to shield Vivian from an emergency vote called on short notice. She was suspended pending a formal review, and Dorian's employment was terminated the same day. He reacted with fury, insisting Vivian had promised to protect him no matter what happened. For the first time, Vivian seemed to understand that the nephew she'd elevated above the entire company had never once prepared himself for the consequences of failure. That evening, alone in his office long after the board members had gone home, Marcus sat with the folder of signed agreements in front of him and felt none of the satisfaction he might once have imagined he would. He thought instead about the engineers who'd worked those brutal nights before the Corestone demonstration, about Elena's careful documentation that no one had wanted to read, about the ordinary people who'd simply shown up to do their jobs inside a structure that had stopped protecting them. Rebuilding a division wasn't, to him, a matter of proving a point to Vivian or savoring her defeat. It was about making sure the next version of Summit couldn't be dismantled by a single person's ego, no matter how much power that person happened to hold. He called Elena that night, not to celebrate but to start planning, already sketching the shape of a leadership structure that wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the one before it. Marcus didn't celebrate their downfall. He understood that hundreds of innocent employees still had their livelihoods hanging in the balance, regardless of what had happened to the people at the top. He spent the following days negotiating directly with creditors, clients, and investors to make sure the acquisition could actually close on solid footing. Grant Kessler agreed to withdraw Vantage's demand for damages if Summit resumed the project under Marcus's direct oversight and met a new, realistic set of milestones. Corestone agreed to return as well, on a smaller scale and with far more reasonable deadlines than the ones that had caused the original disaster. Between those two agreements, Summit's value stabilized just enough to avoid the bankruptcy that had briefly looked inevitable. Before the acquisition papers were finalized, Vivian asked Marcus for one last conversation. She wanted to know whether he'd planned all of this from the day he resigned. Marcus told her honestly that he'd never expected Summit to fall apart at all. He'd only known he could no longer defend a system that had stripped him of both authority and dignity in front of the entire company. Vivian said quietly that he could have warned her. Marcus reminded her that he had, right there on that stage, when he asked whether she expected him to remain accountable while someone else held the actual power to decide. She'd called that question disloyalty at the time. Now she had no answer for it. Before she left, Vivian asked one final thing: whether he felt satisfaction taking back a division that had once belonged to her family. Marcus told her Summit had never truly belonged to any single person, and that her failure had come from believing ownership of a company was the same thing as owning the talent working inside it. The deal was signed not long after, and Marcus faced one last challenge of his own. Walking back into the building he'd once been escorted out of. 6 months after that humiliating exit, he stepped back into the old tower, and this time there was no security detail waiting to walk him out. The employees who remained gathered in the same hall where Vivian had once announced his demotion, unsure whether Marcus intended to lecture them, replace them, or tear the entire structure down and start again from nothing. He stood in the exact spot where Vivian had once declared he'd answer to her nephew. Rather than dwell on the humiliation of that day, he simply announced that Summit would be rebuilt under independent leadership, with a new program granting equity to the people who kept it running. Elena returned as Chief Operating Officer, this time with clearly defined authority that no one could quietly strip away again. Some former employees came back as well, while others chose different paths entirely, and Marcus respected every one of those choices without exception. He told the assembled staff that he hadn't returned to prove Summit could never survive without him, but to build a version of Summit that would never again depend on a single person quietly absorbing every burden alone. He asked that crisis response be distributed across the team rather than concentrated in one office, that client relationships be shared rather than hoarded, and that every risk warning be documented and taken seriously the moment it was raised. He'd learned, through his own costly mistake, that becoming indispensable might make a company successful for a while, but building people who could stand on their own was the only thing that made an organization built to last. A year later, Summit had recovered most of its former clients. Revenue hadn't yet returned to its previous peak, but profits were steady and dependable again, and staff turnover had dropped sharply. Vantage completed its long-delayed rollout on the new, realistic schedule without incident. Longtime employees held equity in the company for the first time in the division's history. Reid Summit now operated as the parent firm overseeing Summit's leadership, and Marcus held the title of managing partner rather than returning to life as someone else's employee. Maya sent her father a short message after reading a business article about the acquisition, telling him that this time the story had finally credited the right person for building it. Marcus smiled, set his phone aside, and walked into his next meeting with the team that now stood beside him rather than beneath him. Vivian had once believed Marcus needed the chair she'd granted him out of her own generosity. Only after she took it away did she finally understand that he'd been the one holding up the entire room all along.